The most important question in Iran news today is not whether Washington and Tehran are talking. They are, at least according to the White House. The harder question is whether talking still matters when missiles are flying, ships are being stopped, oil markets are reacting, and each side is publicly accusing the other of bad faith. As of June 3, 2026, the U.S.-Iran conflict has entered a dangerous middle phase. It is not full-scale open war in the way markets feared in March, but it is also not peace. It is a ceasefire under stress, a negotiation wrapped in military pressure, and a regional crisis where the Strait of Hormuz has become the hinge between diplomacy and escalation. Here's the basic setup. After U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran on February 28th, and after weeks of missiles, drone, and maritime confrontations, Washington and Tehran have been discussing a narrow but potentially consequential bargain. Extend the ceasefire for 60 days, reopen or stabilize shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and use that window to restart negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Axios has reported that U.S. and Iranian negotiators reached agreement on the 60-day Memorandum of Understanding, but that President Trump has not given final approval. The proposed framework would keep the ceasefire alive and call for unrestricted shipping through Hormuz, while nuclear talks resume in parallel. Axios.com. But the politics around that possible deal are messy. President Trump has rejected suggestions that talks have stopped, saying contacts with Iran are continuing. Iranian state-linked outlets, meanwhile, have reported that Tehran suspended indirect exchanges through mediators in protest over Israeli operations in Lebanon and Gaza. That contradiction may be partly tactical. In a negotiation like this, both sides have an incentive to sound tougher in public than they are in private. But it also tells us something real. Trust is thin, and the ceasefire is not strong enough to survive many more shocks. APnews.com. The military side of the story is moving almost as fast as the diplomatic one. U.S. Central Command has said Iranian missiles and drones have been launched toward regional targets and ships near the Strait of Hormuz, and that U.S. forces have intercepted threats and carried out what CENTCOM calls self-defense strikes on Iranian radar, command and control, and drone-related sites, including on Qeshm Island. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has framed its actions as retaliation for U.S. strikes and pressure around the Gulf. These are not background incidents. They are the live stress tests of the ceasefire. Every interception, every disabled vessel, every strike gives hardliners in both capitals more ammunition to argue that the other side cannot be trusted. CENTCOM.mil. The Strait of Hormuz is the place to watch because it is where geopolitics turns into price action. The strait is a narrow waterway linking the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the wider Indian Ocean. The International Energy Agency says about 20 million barrels per day of crude oil and oil products moved through Hormuz in 2025, making it one of the world's most critical energy choke points. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has likewise described Hormuz as the world's most important oil transit choke point, with 2024 flows averaging around 20 million barrels per day, roughly one-fifth of global petroleum liquids consumption. IEA.org. That is why this negotiation is not just about Iran and the United States. It is about shipping insurance. It is about refinery margins. It is about inflation expectations. It is about fertilizer prices, diesel costs, and the risk premium embedded in energy markets. When traders hear that Hormuz might reopen, prices can cool. When they hear about mines, missile launches, drone threats, or disabled vessels, the risk premium comes back. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told lawmakers on June 2nd that reopening the Strait of Hormuz is a key condition for moving into a next phase of negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. He also said the United States has not offered sanctions relief simply in exchange for reopening the strait. In Washington's framing, any sanctions relief would have to be tied to nuclear commitments and actual implementation. That is an important distinction. It means the U.S. is trying to avoid paying twice, once for maritime access and again for nuclear limits. Gulfnews.com. Iran sees it differently. Tehran's leverage comes from several places: its nuclear program, its missile and drone capabilities, its regional relationships, and its position beside Hormuz. So Iran is unlikely to treat the strait as a separate technical issue. For Tehran, maritime access, sanctions relief, recognition of its role in the region, and limits on Israeli operations are all connected. That is why the sequencing problem is so hard. Washington wants Iran to take verifiable steps first. Tehran wants U.S. action first. Both sides want proof before they make concessions. The nuclear issue remains the hardest part of the entire package. The ceasefire extension may buy time, but it does not solve the core disagreement over uranium enrichment, verification, and sanctions. The Trump administration wants a deal it can describe as stronger than the 2015 nuclear agreement. Iran wants relief from economic pressure and recognition that it will not simply surrender its nuclear infrastructure under fire. Those positions are not impossible to reconcile, but they require a level of trust that the current battlefield does not provide. There is also a regional complication. Iran has tied the talks to what it calls an all-front ceasefire, including Lebanon and Gaza. That matters because Israel's operations in Lebanon and clashes involving Hezbollah are now feeding directly into the U.S.-Iran channel. The Associated Press has reported that ceasefires announced across the region are fraying, with fighting continuing in Lebanon, Gaza, and around the U.S.-Iran file. Axios has also reported that fighting in Lebanon threatens to derail the prospects for an Iran deal. APnews.com. So the negotiation is not really one negotiation. It is several negotiations stacked on top of one another. There is the U.S.-Iran ceasefire. There is the Hormuz maritime arrangement. There is the nuclear track. There is the Israel-Hezbollah front. There is the Gaza question. And there is domestic politics inside the United States and Iran. In Washington, Trump faces two competing incentives. One incentive is to deliver a deal that reopens Hormuz, reduces energy price pressure, and gives him a claim that he forced Iran back to the table. The other incentive is to avoid looking like he accepted a temporary pause that lets Iran regroup without making irreversible nuclear concessions. That tension is visible inside the Republican Party, where non-interventionist Trump allies may welcome an exit ramp, while hawks worry that a 60-day pause could become a strategic gift to Tehran. Inside Iran, the leadership picture is opaque. Rubio told Congress that Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei appears to be alive and increasingly engaged, even though he has not appeared publicly since the early phase of the war. That matters because negotiations require someone in Tehran who can make a decision and make it stick. If Iran's leadership is unified, a deal is easier. If power is fragmented among political leaders, clerics, security officials, and the Revolutionary Guard, then even a written memorandum may not hold. The human and economic costs are also spreading well beyond the battlefield. In Iran, the war has worsened an already severe water crisis. Al Jazeera has reported that Iran was already facing multi-year drought and declining precipitation, and that the conflict has added pressure after desalination plants, pipelines, and other civilian infrastructure were hit or threatened. This is not just a humanitarian footnote. Water stress can become political stress, and political stress can narrow the room for compromise. The digital picture is also bleak. Iranians have begun regaining some internet access after a months-long wartime shutdown, but access remains heavily restricted. The Associated Press reported that NetBlocks measured connectivity around 86% of pre-cutoff capacity, while Kentic measured traffic at around 40%, which suggests that being technically connected is not the same as being fully online. Al Jazeera has also reported that many data centers remain offline, and that key internet protocols are blocked or disrupted. And the global ripple effects are real. The Associated Press reported from Senegal that fertilizer prices there have risen about 40% since the war began on February 28, pushing farmers to look for alternatives like manure, composting, and vermiculture. That may sound far removed from the Strait of Hormuz, but it is not. Natural gas is a major input for fertilizer production. Shipping insecurity raises costs, and energy shocks travel through food systems faster than many investors appreciate. So why does all this matter for markets? First, energy. If Hormuz remains disrupted or only partially reopened, oil and refined product markets will keep pricing in geopolitical risk. Even without a full closure, uncertainty can raise insurance costs, slow cargo movement, and distort trade flows. Second, inflation. Higher energy costs do not stay in energy. They pass through transportation, agriculture, chemicals, plastics, and consumer goods. Central banks may look through a short spike, but eventually, the pressure will show up in prices. That's why markets are watching all these dynamics closely. But a longer Hormuz disruption would complicate the inflation picture. Third, defense and shipping. Maritime security, tanker availability, insurance premiums, and naval enforcement all become part of the investment story. The companies most exposed are not only oil majors. They include refiners, chemical producers, agricultural input firms, logistics companies, and insurers. Fourth, political risk. A 60-day memorandum is not a comprehensive peace agreement. It is a bridge. Bridges can hold, but they can also collapse if too much weight is placed on them too quickly. Looking ahead, there are three broad scenarios. The first scenario is managed de-escalation. Trump approves the 60-day memorandum. Iran allows more predictable shipping through Hormuz, and both sides move nuclear talks into a structured channel. In this case, oil markets likely remove some risk premium, though not all of it. Investors would still watch verification, enforcement, and whether regional fighting in Lebanon or Gaza breaks the mood. The second scenario is a rolling ceasefire. This may be the most realistic near-term case. Talks continue, but incidents continue too. Missiles are intercepted, drones are shot down, ships are challenged. Officials deny that the ceasefire is collapsing, even as both militaries keep testing the limits. Markets remain volatile, but not panicked. Diplomacy survives, but just barely. The third scenario is renewed escalation. The trigger could be a deadly strike on U.S. personnel, a major attack on commercial shipping, confirmed mining of key lanes, or a breakdown over nuclear sequencing. In that scenario, Hormuz risk would quickly move from a pricing concern to a supply concern. Energy markets would react first, but the shock would not stop there. The key thing to remember is that the proposed 60-day framework is not the finish line. It is a way to buy time. The real questions are still unresolved. Can Iran accept enforceable nuclear limits? Can Washington offer sanctions relief without appearing to reward coercion? Can Hormuz be reopened in a way that shipowners, insurers, and militaries actually trust? Can Israel, Hezbollah, and other regional actors avoid blowing up the diplomatic track? And can both governments sell restraint at home? For now, the cleanest read is this: both sides are bargaining under pressure. Washington wants verifiable nuclear limits and restored maritime access. Tehran wants sanctions relief, recognition of its leverage, and proof that U.S. commitments will become action. The gap between those positions is not procedural. It is fundamental. That does not mean a deal is impossible. It means any deal will be fragile. For investors, the takeaway is to separate fact from hope. The fact is that talks are still being reported. A 60-day framework has been discussed, and both sides have reasons to avoid a wider war. The interpretation is that diplomacy still has a chance, because neither side appears eager to own the economic consequences of a full Hormuz crisis. The forward-looking risk is that one military incident could outrun the diplomats. This is an informational analysis, not financial, legal, or safety advice. But as a market story, Iran is now much bigger than Iran. It is an energy story, a shipping story, a food cost story, and a test of whether a fragile ceasefire can survive long enough to become something more durable.